Jacques Nadeau, I'm so excited to have this conversation with you. You've been creating a lot of the technology that drives the data world, Arrow, Dremio, and now Sundeck. So let's talk about that.
Absolutely. Well, thanks for having me, Felipe. Yeah, I mean, my goal all along has been, I think that there's so much data out there that's useful. And I think that people continue to struggle with different ways to access that data. So my goal has always been one of trying to create ways for people to access data in more and more powerful paradigms. And so when we started the Apache Arrow project nearly, I think, 8 years ago or something like that, people actually constantly would tell me that that was a ridiculous idea. Why would you want to have an in-memory representation, a common representation of data? But we really believed that it would unlock a large number of capabilities that couldn't currently be accomplished. And specifically giving what would traditionally be data technologies that you could only get if you were like a PhD in databases, and giving that to a large group of users. A lot of people, Python users, for example. And so that's grown to be 65 million downloads last month. I'm super happy with that. And it's part of a sort of a story for me, which is like, hey, how can I figure out different ways that we can give people access to things that they don't have access to today? And so Dremio was much of those same kinds of things in the data lake space in the early days. And Sundeck is focused on that at a different layer. It's thinking about, hey, people should be able to interact with their queries and have a lot more influence over what's happening with their data than what's possible today. And so that's why we started Sundeck.
Yeah, I love how the theme is empowering people with data. And you are looking for where people are right now and what's missing.
Yeah.
And with Sundeck, you are focusing Sundeck on Snowflake users for now?
That's absolutely right. Yeah, so we looked at the market, and Snowflake obviously has a great adoption, has a great ecosystem to create things, and so we actually created two things. The first is we created something called OpsCenter for Snowflake. An OpsCenter for Snowflake is designed to help people understand the consumption that they have on Snowflake, be able to look at what's driving consumption, break things into groups of workloads, right? So even if you're running a lot of different kinds of workloads or use cases on a single warehouse, you can understand what's going on with those things, understand what your utilization is, and then also give you some tools to interact with that. So for example, we have something we call probes, which actually will watch for particular kinds of bad query patterns and automatically cancel those queries. And what's cool about OpsCenter is that it is, we launched it at Summit, as part of the native app public preview. And the OpsCenter capability is entirely free for users. So people can log in, they can sign up, they can add it to their Snowflake account. Data all stays within their Snowflake account because native apps are secure. And we also did something very unique, which is we've also made it available on GitHub. Because we believe that the best way to build a community around this kind of technology is to collaborate with others that are super smart about this too.
Yeah, I love how open source is always at the center of what you do. And with OpsCenter, you're making it available for everyone for free. And it runs as a Snowflake native app, which is a new thing. And you are already in, and you're already making it available, source code, and available as the native app that it is.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so for developers that are watching this, right, like not only can you use that to better understand how you're using your Snowflake, but people who are excited about native apps can also look at it as a way, like as an example app to build against, right? They say, oh, like this is the way you solve a bunch of the problems around testing and deployment and whatnot with native apps. So it can serve both of those purposes.
I can't wait to watch a demo of OpsCenter. But you also have another side of Sundeck.
That's absolutely right. And so the way that we think about it is that you should never have to pay to understand why your consumption is what it is on Snowflake, or be able to sort of do simple things with your warehouses. So scheduling warehouses, managing warehouses, that all should be something that's just available to everybody and should be free of charge. But then what we see is that once you start to understand what's going on with queries, you want to have more influence over them, right? So one of the common patterns that you'll see with when you look at people who are using Snowflake is that they've decomposed the workloads into a lot of different warehouses. And sometimes that can be really, really good and really helpful. And it's very nice for like cost management and understanding who's doing what and separating out this team from that team so that you're not confused about what's going on with workloads. But the downside is that sometimes you can have underutilization on each of those different warehouses. And so you might get into a situation where you say, hey, I'd like to collapse this into a smaller set of warehouses. And OpsCenter allows you to understand what's going on even if you're in a single warehouse. But sometimes you want to actually have that be dynamically done. And so the Sundeck SAS product actually allows us to modify what's going on with queries. So you can actually reroute queries to different warehouses based on the properties of the queries or properties of your underlying warehouses, how much load there is or what time of day or week it is. And then you can also, in addition to just rerouting things, you can also help users. So for example, one of the things that often happens, as the world becomes more and more data driven, what you have is a larger and larger population of users who are interacting with data without a lot of lot of familiarity with the data, right? And so someone who's spending their whole day with data has a very, very high understanding of the data and probably is less likely to make mistakes. Someone who spends 10 minutes a week looking at data is more likely to make mistakes, but we're trying to give them more power tools to do stuff. And so one of the other things that the Sundeck SAS product allows you to do is it allows you to actually watch queries that come in. And if you see something that's an anti-pattern or something that maybe is actually a mistake for the user, you can actually reject that and help the user and say, hey, you know what, actually, if you're going to join these two tables, you should probably do them this way. So that's really powerful. And then the most powerful thing is you can actually start to modify what the query language is capable of doing. So you can modify queries as they come through and do simple things like replacing a count distinct with an approximate count distinct to improve efficiency. But you can also do other things like you can actually say, hey, I want to actually introduce new syntax, and I'll actually demo some of that in just a second.
That's so cool. Yes, I really want to see that live, but let's go first to the demo of OpsCenter.
Yep.
So that will allow us to understand what's happening inside our Snowflake account.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's jump into that. I'll pull it up. And so the first thing to note is I'll start by showing you basically how you actually install a native app, because I think it's so new that people don't always know how to do that. So if you see the screen now, you'll actually see that we're logged into the OpsCenter app. To start with, just so you understand how apps work. So as I said, OpsCenter is a native app. It's in the Snowflake marketplace. So you can just go into Snowflake, search for Sundeck or search for OpsCenter. You'll see the app, and then you can just install it from here and get it into your Snowflake account. And what's great about that is that means that your data is always secure. So your data doesn't go into any other accounts. It's going to stay within your Snowflake account. Yeah.
That's my Snowflake account. I can just install it, and then it's running.
That's exactly right, and it's entirely free. And so what we've done is we've logged in, and so when it first installs, it basically does a little bit of analysis against your underlying query history table, your warehouse events history, some of the other operational information that's inside your Snowflake account, and it produces a number of analyses for you. One of the ones that's probably most interesting for people who, when they first start with OpsCenter, is what we call the warehouse heat map. Okay, and that's what we're showing on the screen right now. And so the warehouse heat map looks at your consumption over time of your warehouses, and it looks at how effectively you're using your warehouse capacity, right? So you may start a warehouse, you may run one query on the warehouse, and then it may stay up for a little while idle and then shut down again, okay? And so this looks at not only what is the amount of resources that are being taken up by the queries that are running during the time that the warehouse is up, but also the idle time. And so ideally, you would want to get as close to 100% utilization of your warehouse as possible, but different things can influence that. So for example, if you start a query, you run a query for 1 second, the warehouse then gets shut down 60 seconds later, well, you're going to have 1 out of 60 seconds worth of utilization at best. That query was really small and only used a little teeny fraction of the overall warehouse, you'll probably even below that percentage. And so what we try to do is give people an understanding of what's going on with the warehouses and seeing what the utilization is. And so what you see here is basically a color coding from light purple to dark purple of how much we are consuming our capacity on the set of warehouses inside of this particular Snowflake account.
And this is running based on the history. You don't need to have OpsCenter running in the past to collect all this data. This data is in Snowflake already. It's your account history. And now you get a chart like this for the warehouses.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So the data goes back far before when OpsCenter even existed. So it goes back and looks over time. And what you can see here is what you often see with organizations is you'll see some places where you're getting up into the 80 to 90% utilization. So there are some days where you can see here we got 95% on this particular day. But then you also see a lot of lighter periods. And in this particular warehouse, or the collection of warehouses in this account, you see a lot of light periods on the weekends. And this is a pretty common pattern that we see is basically people potentially build up their warehouses for weekday traffic, the activity inside the organization for weekdays. On the weekends, it's probably more divided than what you would probably like. And so if you only have one user who comes in and starts a warehouse, odds are they're not actually going to use the capacity of that warehouse during the times that they're running the queries. And when it's more sporadic, like on a weekend where someone might only be pulling up a dashboard on rare occasion, you're more likely to see that overall utilization be lower. So that's the first thing that OpsCenter will show you. The second thing is that OpsCenter gives you this concept of probes. And probes allow you to monitor queries. And so this is all built inside of Snowflake, so it takes advantage of serverless tasks. And what it does is it allows you to define different kinds of conditions. It watches active queries that are running in the system, and then based on whether those active queries match this condition, it decides something to do. And the two things it can do is it can either notify someone, so it can email either the writer of the query or say a manager who's managing the process or a platform team, or it can actually directly cancel the query. So if you want to have a warehouse and say, hey, if it's a query pattern where I'm doing cross joins and it's taking more than 3 minutes, I want to just automatically cancel that query. And so that's all built into the way that Snowflake already works and takes advantage of all the things that are inside of Snowflake.
What kind of conditions can you write here?
So these conditions are against the what's called the query history table function, and so you can write arbitrary SQL against that. So this is actually is technically a where clause. So it is no SQL that you're going to actually be writing inside of that box.
And you can see it on live queries, especially if a query is taking too long, you can react.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so you might say, I'm going to set a limit at 5 minutes to email people, and at 10 minutes, I'm going to automatically cancel it. Right? So avoid having to have someone sitting there watching this stuff. And this is especially nice on the weekends and the evenings. And so then the next thing is what we have are called labels. And so inside of OpsCenter, labels are very similar to, if you're familiar with Gmail labels, it's the ability to categorize. But instead of categorizing email, we're categorizing queries. Okay? And so one of the common patterns is you've got groups of queries that you want to look at together. Okay, so I might want to have queries like, and so we've got a couple of examples here. We've got queries that spilled, queries that had long compilation, queries that were using acceleration, queries that were free, queries that were over $1 each time they executed. And so you can basically build these up, and all of these are based on SQL as well. So you can define arbitrary conditions for whatever kind of groupings that you want to have. So if you want to say, hey, it's involving these 3 tables, and we have actually functions inside of Snowflake that allow you to figure out what tables are in each query using SQL. And so you can actually go and say, okay, let me figure out what's going on with these queries, and then I can group those together. And so that inside of the experience here then allows you to look at query history over time and query activity. We create a cost per query. And then for that cost per query, we can then subdivide that for individual workloads. So you can say, hey, this workload cost me this much, that workload cost me that much. And so you can see over time whether or not different groups of people are influencing things. And so here we can actually see those different filters that were created, the labels that were created before. And so for example, here I'm actually going to look at Streamlit operations. So we'll look at other Streamlit queries on this particular system. And now we're actually coloring that by the users on this particular system. This is an internal development system we have. And we can see here that there's a Robert. During the month of June, Robert was the single biggest driver of query costs. He drove almost $60 worth of query costs using Streamlit operations.
Is that 100? No, it's not 100%. It's $120.
Dollars.
Dollars.
Yeah. And so one of the things that's in here is that because people potentially are not paying rate, you can go in and actually configure what your specific costs are to make sure that that's correct for your organization.
Nice. And to calculate the query cost, you have some algorithm to figure out, like moving from the cost of the warehouse to how do we divide it per individual query?
That's exactly right. And it's a really interesting domain of thought itself. And so first, reminding you before, we put all of this code inside of GitHub as well. So you can go and look at the algorithm and agree or disagree with it. But what we do is we look at the overall utilization or consumption of each query against the warehouse. So queries, one of the things that Snowflake does report is the warehouse utilization associated with the query. So it might say, hey, 20% or 100%. And so we look at that, and then we then associate or attribute cost of individual queries to different queries based on their overall consumption and time that they run on the warehouse. And we actually came up with what we think is an important distinction. We actually talk about 2 different costs. We talk about what we call loaded cost and unloaded cost. And so unloaded cost is looking at the query assuming that there's no wastage, right? So if you imagine you start a warehouse, you run a query for 5 seconds, and then you shut it down 5 seconds later, right? Theoretically, there's wastage there because the warehouse was running for 5 seconds where you weren't running a query. And so unloaded cost says, let's ignore the wastage and just look at this particular query. And in an assumption that the system is used 100% efficiently, this is what I want to understand with the query. And that's really, really important if you're trying to, for example, track workloads over time. So, if my data size is growing 20% each month for this particular use case or dashboard, I want to look at, what's the growth of that cost over time, independent if I have a different amount of wastage one day versus another, right? But if you're actually trying to understand cost and actually figure out how to minimize and maximize efficiency of your Snowflake investment, then you'll look at what we call loaded cost, which actually also allocates the wastage to the individual queries, right? And so depending on the particular analysis, you really want to think about one of those numbers versus the other.
Yeah, we can live in both worlds because if we go back to the warehouses chart,
yep.
If we manage to improve the utilization of warehouses during the weekends, not by making any change on our query patterns, but just how we scale our warehouses,
yep.
Then the cost per query will go down without making any change on my query or my query patterns.
Yes, exactly. And so in that situation, it's not very helpful to look at that number when you're actually trying to figure out how to make a workload more efficient, right? Because it's kind of 2 different things. It's like workload optimization versus warehouse optimization, and you got to be focused on both of them.
Nice.
Yeah. So that's a quick overview of OpsCenter. Do you want to jump into a quick overview of the SaaS product that we have that connects to OpsCenter to extend capabilities?
Let's go to the other side. Once we have this running on our Snowflake account for free, open source, native app, no data goes out. I love it. How do we make this more powerful with the SAS?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let me just give you first, show you a quick slide here, which describes sort of how Sundeck works. And so Sundeck sits actually in front of Snowflake. Any tool that knows how to talk to Snowflake can talk to Sundeck, okay? And what we do is we give data engineers, data platform teams, what we call hooks. And hooks allow you to actually modify what's happening to the query before it hits Snowflake, okay? And so that could be as simple as saying, hey, like, this is a query we never want to run on Snowflake, let me reject it, right? And so a really simple example of that might be is, I have a really large fact table. It's got 20 billion records inside of it. A junior analyst comes in and just says, query the whole table. Right? No predicates on that, no where clauses on that. It's probably not a helpful query for anybody. So, hey, maybe you should put a limit on that, or you need to put a predicate on that, right? And so Sundeck with its hooks can actually look at that query and say, okay, I want to hold off on running that query on Snowflake and tell the user, hey, please adjust your query to put a predicate or a limit on that query. So anyway, so it sits in front of Snowflake, but it acts like Snowflake. So any tool that knows how to talk to Snowflake can talk to Sundeck. You just change how the connection string is set, and then queries that are then submitted to Snowflake. So Sundeck doesn't actually do any data processing. It sends the queries on to Snowflake. And then the responses come straight back to the tools. So that's how Sundeck works, and it fits into the system. And so let me just jump in here. And I'm actually going to show a demo here to start in Hex. So Hex is a BI tool. It sits on top of Snowflake. Is very.
You love Hex.
Yeah, you love Hex, and it's designed to work with Snowflake. Well, it's a perfect example of how Sundeck can fit into this ecosystem. So Hex knows nothing about Sundeck. Sundeck didn't exist when Hex was built, and yet you can actually use Sundeck with Hex because Sundeck just acts like Snowflake, and you just define your Snowflake connection string to connect to Sundeck to do Snowflake stuff. And so I'm going to show you a really simple example here. I've got that simple case where the user is just running a query against the transactions table. So the first case is that they're a user that's actually running a query that has a date clause, okay? So I'll execute this query against Snowflake, okay, via Sundeck. And this query should come back in just a second here, if everything goes well during a demo. Let's see here.
All right, there you go. Select star from the past.
Yeah, select star from the past. So this is a very simple example, right? But basically, I have a where clause. So the query in this situation, we say, hey, let's let the query through to Snowflake and run it inside of inside of Snowflake. Okay, I'm going to run a second query. This query, I didn't do the job of actually even thinking about a where clause. And as I said, this is a very, very trivial example. This is not a fancy example, but I'm going to run this same query against the same connection, running against Snowflake, and momentarily here. Yeah, it's exciting times. Always to watch. I'll get an error message back, okay? So this is Sundeck helping out. And what it's telling the user is, hey, we want you to run this query with a filter against that table.
Yes.
Okay? So we're just trying to tell the user, hey, let's be a little more cautious of how we're using these things. And this is obviously a very simple example. And the way that this works is that we have something called a flow inside of Sundeck. So now we're in the Sundeck UI. And a flow basically defines a set of operations that apply to a query before and after it executes inside of Snowflake, okay? And the very first thing we have here is what we call a reject hook. And this reject hook says, reject queries against transactions that have no filter, okay? And we use what we call Q-like, which is a way to match query strings with understanding of syntax. So it's not string-based, it actually understands how queries work. And we say, hey, any query that's querying against the public transactions table but does not have, so we say not SQL Q-like, with a where clause, we're going to reject this. So it's basically a simple if-then. So if this, then do that. In this case, we're saying if this is the pattern of the query, we're going to reject that query.
I'm not going to let this query pass.
That's exactly. I'm going to stop this query from coming through. So that's a very simple example. I'll show you a second example here, which is I'm going to have a situation where I have two queries. And so this is a situation where you may have different warehouses for different purposes, but you can't control necessarily how people are accurately using the right warehouse for the right use case, right? So it might be I have an interactive warehouse that people can interact with, and something that's more like a batch warehouse that people can interact with. And it may be the case that people are running their batch queries in the interactive warehouse, and you're like, well, that's hurting over consumption. It makes the ETL queries go longer or the batch queries go longer because maybe the warehouse is sized for smaller interactive queries. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to run two queries against the flow, the Sundeck flow. The first one is a two-table join. And the second one is a 3-table join. And again, this is a very simple example for demo purposes. So in both cases here, the query comes back, right? There's no question, like the query comes back. I don't know what's going on behind the scenes, and I don't need to worry about it as a user, right? But we're going to actually hit the query history table that Snowflake provides us and look at where those queries ran. And so what you can see here is the 2-way query ran against the demo warehouse, but the 3-way query ran against the batch warehouse. And so this is Sundeck dynamically rerouting one of the queries to a different warehouse based on the properties of the query. In this case, how many tables are joined together.
It could be the number of tables, or it could be the tables.
It could be the number of tables. It could be the user and the role and a certain time of day. Like the ability, you can have arbitrary.
Sunday,
yeah, but if it's Sunday and this is a big query, let's run it on the main warehouse because the main warehouse isn't that busy on Sundays, right? Yeah, and so that's also defined here. So that's a second hook in this same flow. And we basically just say reroute joins to the batch warehouse. And so here we've got a couple of different conditions. We say, first, I'm targeting the demo warehouse. Well, and we want the demo warehouse to only be interactive queries, so let's focus on those queries. The second one is, this is not the superstar analyst. Right? Like maybe the superstar analyst knows what they want to do, let's leave them alone, right? And then the third one is actually using this Q-like again to look at the query pattern, and it's saying any select query against 3 tables. And you'll note here that this is actually a old style where join, right? Like we're not actually using an ANSI style join here. And as a user, I actually wrote an ANSI style join, right? So I said join on, right? And so this is an example of how that's actually an intelligent pattern matching. So it actually understands that joins, whether they're expressed as where clause joins or ANSI joins, are both still joins. And so we can identify those either ways. So we're doing some intelligent work behind the scenes for this. But anyway, you can basically set up these flows. And as I said, you have the pre-hooks, which actually can modify the queries, reject them, reroute them, rewrite them, all inside the context of Sundeck before they send on to Snowflake. And then we have post hooks, which actually can look at what's going on after the fact. So after a query completes inside of Snowflake, are there certain tasks that we would like to take based on what was the nature of that query? And so if you show here, I'll show you quickly the example of a rewrite. And this is a very simple one. You've worked with Snowflake a lot. You know that there are certain kinds of constructs inside of Snowflake that you can't execute as inside of a select clause. So for example, show shares. You can't use show function outputs inside of other select clauses without writing a bunch of NoSQL scripting, right?
I've been there.
You've been there, right? And so we said, wouldn't it be nice if Snowflake worked like Bash? In Bash, you can actually use backticks to say, run this part of the operation first, and then take the value of the output of that and give it to something else. And we said, hey, wouldn't it be nice if Snowflake could do the same thing? Okay? And so that's exactly what we did with Sundeck here. And so here you can see that we actually have show shares. We've put that in backticks, and then we're actually doing a select statement against that. Okay? And so if I execute this, you'll see that I'll get back some results. So I get back a table, right? So from a user's perspective, I've now given you a much simpler way to interact with these values than what would otherwise be the case. And behind the scenes, Sundeck is rewriting this to take advantage of Snow scripting to get this done, right? But the user doesn't need to worry about any of that complexity.
Select from show.
Yeah,
select from show. How did you make this happen?
Yeah. So yeah, it basically constructs up a bunch of operations in Snowflake to get this to the place. And so it's fun with show. We have another example here where you can actually union the results of 2 create table as's, so other kinds of operations which you can't take the output from. But another really interesting way to use this is that sometimes, as much as you always want the data warehouse to be as smart as possible and it solves all your problems, sometimes you know that this part of the query should run before that part of the query, right? And so in those situations, you can just take a subquery and put backticks around that, and we will also execute that first and then use the results of that in the rest of the query. So if you want to do your own hand optimization of making sure that the optimizer is working just right, you can also play with it that way. And this is just a fun example of all of the different kinds of things you can do at this intermediate layer. So the experience I've had is shown that large organizations, as they get more and more sophisticated with data, start to create, and I've seen several bespoke systems inside of large financial services companies that do something like this. But it's always big teams, it's very expensive and very hard to maintain. And most organizations can't hire a big team to try to build something by hand for this. And so what we did is say, let's come up with a way to make this really simple for users to use so that they can play with this stuff and take advantage of the power.
This is beautiful. There's so much I want to play with queries, change Snowflake to do whatever I wanted to do, talk to my users inside my account and tell them, hey, you're trying this, you should try this, either with this table or this pattern. just by using these constructs.
Yeah, that's the goal.
The demo is amazing. I see why everyone should try it, why I should try it. Now, let's talk about building a business on Snowflake. Why, how? Tell me more.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, when we were looking at where we think this is an opportunity for all kinds of queries, is you want to have more power, you want to give those users more capability. But when we were looking at different opportunities of how to do that, it was very clear that Snowflake had the right group of users in terms of like how people think about and work with data, and then really had a great platform for how to build an application like this. And so we basically charge based on the amount of queries that run through our system. When you're using the SaaS product, obviously as we mentioned before, OpsCenter is entirely free. But when you're using the SaaS product, it's based on the number of queries, and then we also price it based on the level or the tier of Snowflake that you're using, so the edition that you're using.
Yeah. So I see many parts to this question. One is that with the Snowflake, you're finding the users that you want to talk to.
Mm-hmm.
Like there is a need to build this layer, and many people are building it in parallel. You are building one solution that most people can use. And then you find them that a lot of them are using Snowflake.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
And then you have a consumption model that, again, reflects on what Snowflake, how people pay for Snowflake.
Yeah, no, it very much sort of a pay-as-you-go kind of simple to understand pricing model that's very much tied to the value that an organization is getting out of it is something I think that is core to how Snowflake prices, and it also matches very well with how we like to price. And actually some of the newer things that Snowflake has announced, we're really excited about and want to engage more with, right? So the ability to use pre-commit expenditure buy-down using is something that we would like to have a way to offer our product. You guys have also launched the metering capability for native apps so that you can actually charge metering-based pricing through Snowflake directly. That's also a very, very exciting thing that we're looking forward to taking advantage of.
Yeah, so now you're mentioning building blocks that Snowflake is giving you. One of them is native apps. With native apps, you can just give people a free app that runs on their Snowflake account.
Yeah, well, and it's great because one is it makes it very easy, but the big one, right, is that like Sundeck, we're a young company, and so a lot of people don't know about us, and so being able to provide something that adds a lot of value without someone have to first think through what are the security ramifications of working with this smaller company, right? And so native apps is a great way to do that, right? So nobody wants to move their data out of Snowflake. And so being able to keep my data inside of Snowflake, but get real additional value about that data through native apps has been super helpful for us. And then we're also very, very excited about extending that. So we actually take advantage of 95% of Snowflake's capabilities in terms of extensibility. So there's functions, there's table functions. We use Snowpark inside of our native app and in our core product. We use stages and whatnot. And one of the things we're really excited about is the container services, which we just launched, right? And trying to figure out how we can run even more of our app inside of Snowflake. Because it's really great if I can run my app and it's built mostly on Python or SQL or Java or JavaScript. But if you're building with something else, it's a little bit harder right now. And we're really excited about container services because it really closes that gap.
With container services, you will be able to run the SaaS side of Sundeck within the Snowflake account of your users, instead of having a proxy outside.
That's exactly right. And right now we basically run in all the regions that are Snowflake regions because we want to be as close to the Snowflake accounts as possible. But being able to deploy that inside of a customer's Snowflake account, one, it means that it's much simpler for us from a technical perspective. But two, it also continues to especially extend that sort of umbrella of security that customers would like as they're working with smaller companies.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack here. Just to divide a little bit it. One is how is Sundeck going to be well known? Is you have a free app as a native app that runs on the Snowflake account of your customers. So you don't need, as a company, you don't need to think about where are you going to run this or power it. Just let Snowflake run it.
Yeah, and also the ability for people to trust that.
Yes,
right.
Everything is secure. It's running within their account. Nothing is exfiltrated or they don't have to deal with another company.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And then when you're charging for your product, Snowflake is giving you these constructs too.
Yeah.
One, the container service, again, as it comes live, people will be able to run the whole of Sundeck inside their account. And there's the capacity for you to charge for native apps and make it part of the
Yeah, that's exactly right. So yeah, so it's the, well, and I think it's like, it's like kind of a couple of things. So it's like the technical tools. Like, do you, like, anytime you work inside of a framework, you're like, okay, what are the components of that framework? And are there enough components that I don't have to build everything from scratch, right? And so Snowflake, by having a large ecosystem of core capabilities that you can build on top of, has been very, very helpful from the technical side. And then there's the monetization side, right? Like being able to solve a lot of those problems without having to build your own infrastructure, and also have to build an whole set of separate sort of consumption capabilities for the customer, or how they consume, is really, really good. And then there's the trust side as well. Yeah. So to me, it's like the technical components. There's the, how easy is it to create something that people can consume and buy easily. And then like, how is it I can manage the trust stuff and make sure that people are feeling very comfortable about consuming from us.
Nice. And how are you interacting with the rest of the Snowflake ecosystem? There are so many other partners, and you are allowing them to add Sundeck to their offering, like let's say Hex, as we saw in the demo, and more partners. How's that relationship going?
Yeah, it's early. So like the first thing that we had to do, I mean, the product's only been out as we're doing this interview, I think 6 weeks. So it's a very, very young in the market. But one of the things that we're doing is we're trying to make sure that we certify with all of the different companies that work with Snowflake, right? And so if you go to our website, I think we've got a dozen or so tools that we've already certified and made sure we're working well. Hex is an example of that. And so making sure that everything works well, and then trying to give people additional tools that are well integrated with those technologies. And one of the early conversations that we've had is that there's a lot of organizations, especially on the OpsCenter side, there's a lot of organizations that struggle with explaining, like, I remember hearing a story about someone who created a Fivetran warehouse, and a bunch of people ran queries against the Fivetran warehouse, and then Fivetran got a call like, hey man, why is Fivetran spending so much money? And it wasn't because Fivetran was doing a bunch of queries, it was because other people were using the Fivetran warehouse to run queries, right? And so being able to understand what's going on with the different query workloads, and being able to, like, to me, the greatest thing about cloud is elasticity. And the most painful thing about cloud is elasticity, right? Because you can do whatever you need to do, but it means that there's less friction to accidentally doing more than you would want to do. And so helping people to make sure that they understand what's going on and manage that, I think, is really, really valuable. One of the things we haven't talked about is this hypothesis I had. And when we first started Sundeck, I was looking at Snowflake, and I think that Snowflake has the potential that AWS had maybe 15 years ago. And so when AWS first came out, people were basically consuming first level services, right? So they were using EC2 and they were using S3. And people continue to use EC2 and S3. But the reality is now is that most people are consuming SaaS products that are built 5 layers above AWS, right? And so AWS is an engine that has got a lot of core sort of Lego blocks that are then built up into something that is much more sort of packaged for a particular use case or solution or whatever. I think that there's the same opportunity with Snowflake, right? Snowflake started coming into the market doing more data warehousing workloads, and it was your data warehouse. But as the data has gotten more and more populated there, and the platform has grown into this vision of the data cloud, what I think is going to happen is the same thing that happened inside of AWS, is that people will be lots and lots of the consumption that's happening in Snowflake isn't going to be people running queries directly against the warehouse. It's going to be all the applications that are built several layers on top. And so that's part of why we started the company, is we think that that's a really, really interesting trajectory over the next 10 years, is moving from, data cloud, like at the start, to like, what does that really look like in 10 years?
Yes. And as we are talking about this evolving world, we have to mention AI.
Yeah.
How do you see Sundeck being like as a proxy for everything that's happening between the data, Snowflake, and those 5 layers? Yeah,
no, absolutely. Well, so there's a couple of interesting things there. So the first is that what AI does, and the foundational models, the large language models specifically, is allowing people to interact with more technical stuff with less technical knowledge, right? And so I can do something in plain English as opposed to having to write code, right? That's like one of the really powerful paradigms that's shifting, right? What's really interesting about that is that it continues to lower the bar of access to data, which is awesome. But it also means 2 things. One is that means that your workloads just increase by, maybe an order of magnitude, right? You're going to have way more queries than you did before because the effort to actually write a query is much lower. And the second one is that because you're working with people who are more and more disconnected from day-to-day data work, you have a much, much higher likelihood of mistakes or misunderstandings, right? And so from our perspective, as a system that sort of helps with those things of understanding your consumption and managing that consumption, as well as allowing you to avoid mistakes and sort of enhance things, this is just a huge opportunity for us. I think the second thing is that like as we look at this longer term, is there's really an interesting question about how you can actually extend that set of models to interact with the kinds of works that we're doing. Right, and so right now we, for example, we write labels with where clauses, right? Why isn't that, just human language? Like, why isn't it just straight plain English? When I'm configuring things to say like, hey, like I want to say to you, like, hey, I want to replace all my account distincts to approximate account distincts when people are querying, when they're doing the distinct against the user ID on this giant fact table, right? We can say that in plain English. Why can't I actually be able to express that elsewhere? Inside the tool. So I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities there, but our goal at the end of the day is first give people the power, and then you can figure out better and better ways to package that power so that less and less sophisticated users can use it.
And you get to be on the middle of it.
Yeah.
And since this is new, as we're recording this is just launched some weeks. How is the world reacting to it?
Very, very positive. I mean, I think we're now have OpsCenter users in 15 Snowflake regions. Something like that. Like basically all of the Amazon regions, which I think were the first for the public preview launch. So a lot of consumption there. We're starting a community so people can collaborate and whatnot, which is good. And then on the SaaS side, we've had a lot of really great engagement. Got a couple dozen users that are using the SaaS product already. And it ranges from small organizations that aren't spending that much on Snowflake to very, very large Fortune 50 kinds of organizations and things like financial services. So it's a range of different people because all of them are wanting to do the same thing, which is maximize their investment.
That's great. And what are the next steps for people watching us? You mentioned the community, you mentioned trying the product. Where do we go now? Yeah,
so I think you've got different options. So the thing I always say to everybody is just install OpsCenter. It's free. It's going to give you better insight into what's going on with your Snowflake. And so I always just recommend that. It's easy. You just go to the marketplace and you find that. If you think you want to take more action, that's what we see, is that you start by understanding what's going on and then you want to take more action. And the Sundeck SAS product basically gives you the ability to take a lot more action. And so you can try that out for free as well on our website.
Jacques Nadeau, thank you very much. Thank you everyone for tuning in to Powered by Snowflake today with Sundeck and Jacques Nadeau.